I think one point also to remember is that Filipinos were heads of the cultural agencies of government almost from the start of the American period. You know, people like Epifanio de los Santos at the National Library, so they in a sense, were in charge of this aspect of nation building. The Philippinization of government took place rather rapidly. It's interesting, of course, of course, the Americans recognized that education was kind of a critical area of government. That's why the last government department that had a Filipino as its head was the Department of Education. But generally, people like Rafael Palma, Epifanio, those early 20th century intellectuals, Epifanio de los Santos, Rafael Palma, who was like Conrado Benitez, really the leading public intellectuals at the beginning of the 20th century. They effectively were the ones who were involved in matters of cultural promotion. So, and they did not see any contradiction between doing this and working a sense of constructive relationship with the American rulers.
And of course, these people you mentioned who were behind the state institutions that sort of managed civic nationalism, they themselves were ilustrados.
Yes.
So
yes.
how can we distinguish them from the first generation of ilustrados of the late 19th century? Are there differences between them?
No, I think the most important difference was that in the transition to U.S. rule was that there was almost among in a sense the high public intellectuals of the country, almost unanimous acceptance of the principles, as it were, of American rule as a transition to full nationhood. So, the leading intellectuals. It's different in the case of Rizal, because in the end, by the end of the Spanish period, there was the sense that Spanish rule had become completely untenable and there had to be a change of power. Whereas at the beginning of the 20th century, most intellectuals felt that they were at the beginning of a new era, and now the time is to build a sense of nationhood and so on, looking forward to the time when the Philippines will become a fully independent these were the premises of nation building in the the mantra at the beginning of in the early 20th century was nation building, so that's why there's a great deal of activity in all cultural fields with respect to defining what is Filipino, defining what constitutes the national, and so on. So that's if you're a student of literature, when did you ask a question when did a national efforts to write a national literary history start? Or even in history, if you are going to do a study of the beginnings of a Philippine, in a sense, a national history of the Philippines. So you probably would begin with Rizal's annotations of the Morga. If you're talking about a Philippine history from a Filipino viewpoint, is right? kind of a Philippine national history, you can probably begin with Rizal's annotations of Morga, because I think that is the intent of Rizal, except that he recognized that he did not have the time to do kind of a national history. So he decided that the easier and the quicker way to do it would be just to take a history that already exists and annotate it. And that is, so in a sense, Rizal's annotations to the Morga is almost like a kind of an exercise towards the writing of a kind of a shadow history of the Philippines. So, and then the next attempts would be, there were attempts by people like Pedro Paterno and well, even Isabelo de los Reyes to write a Philippine history. But when did we have, like, in a sense, what you might call like a kind of a codified, canonical national history? So already with like Conrado Benitez and kind of, and of course, mainly because in the case of Rizal and his contemporaries, these were individual efforts, and kind of they did not have the means to propagate them. Whereas, like by the at the time of in the early 20th century, like textbooks, of course, are the principal the principal instruments for creating a sense of national history. So that's why, like Conrado Benitez, Leandro Fernandez became, in a sense, had an influence, a really far-reaching influence, because they were the textbooks of Philippine history in the public schools. So the construction, as it were, of kind of the canonical Philippine history begins in the early 20th century, not in the time of Rizal and his contemporaries.
Now, Professor, at this point in the interview, let's go beyond the scope of your article. Do you think the Philippines today has a pantheon of heroes? Do you think the country needs to have one?
I don't think, as I suggested earlier, I don't personally think it's a good idea, kind of, because kind of it raises a lot of problems, and I think it's going to be difficult to kind of enact. Like, if you, for instance, if it acquires an official character, the government says the following persons are conferred the title of national heroes. You can imagine that's there a lot of there will be a lot of dissent, with respect to, because there is always the case, why this, why not this, and in the final analysis, it's not something to be legislated. It's after all, like, heroes exist only when the public imagine them to be such, isn't that right? Without public imagining, without the people's imagining, heroes will not exist. So in the final analysis, it's because people look up to them as heroes. That would be, in a sense, kind of the final test, and that's why kind of especially today, with the really expansion of media because of technology, kind of the danger is that how kind of that can be, of course, be manipulated as to like what people would, through the use of kind of social media, build up what they would claim to be like the popular, which means it's kind of, that's something you have to kind of be wary about.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Mojares, for sharing with us your research findings, your insights. We are thankful for granting us for you granting us this
Yeah.
interview.
Thank you for this conversation as well.
Thank you very much, Professor.
Okay.